Hi, I'd like to welcome everybody to a great good place for books tonight. We are so excited to have Sheba Karim here, and she's going to be talking about her amazing new book, The Marvelous Mirza Girls. And I know I'm going to get your name wrong again, Mathangi, right?
That was close, Mathangi.
Mathangi.
Yes.
Um, and I'm very embarrassed because she's an incredibly good friend of the store, and we love her dearly. We loved her first book called A People's History of Heaven. And tonight they're going to talk about Sheba's book. They're going to talk about the art of writing and all kinds of exciting things. So let's welcome them here to a great good place.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
So I think we're going to get started. Sheba, I think you're going to read a little for us, right?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it.
Start with some reading. So I'm going to read an excerpt from toward the beginning of the book, and just to give you some background, it's Noreen's graduation dinner. She's just graduated from high school. So she's at a celebratory dinner with her mother, Ruby, and Adi uncle, who is her godfather and her mother's best friend. And probably the only other thing you need to know is that a year earlier, Noreen's aunt, her mother's sister, passed away of cancer. And so Noreen is still processing and dealing with the grief of her aunt's passing. Graduation dinner began with oysters and a bottle of Prosecco. Noreen wasn't one for alcohol or pot. In varying degrees, both brought her down, then pummeled her with dark thoughts. You'll never write anything worthwhile, and anyway, your writing sucks. Your mother could die, the uncle could die, you could die. If you were funnier, smarter, prettier, better writer, maybe your father would want to know you. But the dinner was a celebration in her honor, and she felt obliged to sip from her mother's proffered glass. And as Ruby and Adi uncle reminisced about a dingy summer sublet they once shared in Williamsburg before it became hopelessly hipster, she considered her aunt, in present tense, the window in the coffin. In her afterlife research, she'd read about the theory of the torture of the grave, that right as your grave filled with the last of the dirt, your spirit returned to your body, and Munkar and Nakir arrived. Munkar and Nakir were demon angels, blue-faced, black-eyed, with wild hair and mile-wide shoulders. They came to test your faith, interrogating you with tongues that breathed fire. If you failed, your grave became an oppressive, stifling space with a small window overlooking hell, and worms would slowly consume your flesh, causing excruciating pain. In this manner, you would await the day of judgment. But if you passed, your grave became spacious and comfortable, a penthouse suite for the dead, with a floor-to-ceiling view of the Garden of Paradise. Sonia Khala prayed and fasted, and she was good and kind. The torture of the grave, it couldn't possibly be true. But if it was, then Noreen was certain Sonia Khala would pass the test, would be enjoying her Egyptian linens and paradise views. But, Noreen thought, what if she didn't want to look upon Jannatul Firdaus? What if instead she wanted to see her sons, her husband, Noreen, on stage today, accepting her diploma? What if she was thinking, fuck the gardens and rivers of paradise, show me my kids? Except Sonia Khala didn't curse. The fictional character based on Sonia Khala that Noreen wrote, used to write, swore once in a while. She should change that. Anyway, her mother, both real and fictionalized, swore enough for a whole tribe. Norbert, what you thinking? Ruby asked. Come back to the present. Smile, crack a joke, graduation dinner with the two living people you love most. About how much you swear. Noreen glanced at her plate. Man, I like oysters, but sometimes it's better not to look too close. I used to hate oysters. They look so moist, the uncle said, cringing as he said moist. He selected the smallest oyster remaining on the ice. But now I love them. Do you think they have oysters in India? I don't know if I'd trust them, though, if they did. India, Noreen repeated. The look exchange between Adi uncle and her mother was subtle and fleeting, but Noreen knew them well enough to both notice it and understand. What's going on? What have you not told me? I thought you did tell her, the uncle said to Ruby. There's nothing to tell, Ruby said. Oh, yes, there is, Noreen said. Come on. As long as no one's dying in a few months from cancer, I can handle it. Terrible joke. Grief and Prosecco was not a good look on her. Sorry, but seriously, spill it. You know this is one of my pet peeves. Her mother drummed her fingers against the table. The foundation is interested in supporting projects in India, and they asked if I'd be willing to relocate to New Delhi for a few months to do a kind of assessment report. Assessment report? They want me to meet with different NGOs, see which types of projects have good outcomes, what the different challenges are. Wow, cool. Are you going to go? They can send someone else. It's bad timing. You're starting college, and neither of us is exactly in our best state. That's your precondition for going to India, Noreen said, that both of us be in our best state? How do you even define that? Exactly, the uncle said. If they'd been home, her mother would have gotten up and started pacing. Instead, she bounced one leg under the table and began to rearrange the empty oyster shells across the bed of ice. I don't want to leave you. It's your first semester of college. What if you need me? Don't worry about me, Noreen said. I'll be fine. I can understand why you wouldn't want to go, the uncle said, but you've wanted to live abroad since I've known you. Remember how upset you were when we both got accepted to study abroad and your parents wouldn't let you go? I'm not moving halfway around the world while my daughter is still grieving. The couple next to them paused their conversation. Ruby cleared her throat, smoothed the napkin over her lap. The uncle reached over to rest his hand on her knee. The table stopped vibrating. I really am fine, Noreen said. I'm learning to dance with a limp. Wait till you see my moves at my wedding. Noreen's therapist had once quoted a writer, comparing grief to having a broken leg that doesn't heal right and still hurts when it's damp outside. But eventually you learn to dance with a limp. It was a weird analogy, but it had stuck. Love the happy face, the waiter said, referring to what Ruby had done with the oyster shells. He was a lanky hipster in a red bow tie and carried 3 appetizer plates, one balanced on his forearm. The uncle always overordered. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you. I just love this book, and as you're reading it, it's just like so cinematic. Like I hope someone makes a TV show or a movie or something out of it because you just write such beautiful scenes. So I just want to start by saying, well, congratulations on this book, but also this is your 4th book. So how has your writing sort of changed from book to book, and like what have you learned, and then what do you also feel like you're sort of continuously learning as you write?
Yeah, those are good questions. So I feel like my writing really reflects the things that I am thinking about and the things that I feel that are either have been missing from my life or that I want to explore further. So for example, Skunk Girl, which is my first YA novel, was loosely based on sort of my upbringing. It was set in a town similar to where I grew up, and it was also set, you know, in the early 90s, which is when I was a teenager. And when I was writing that, I feel like I was really fulfilling this craving, this desire that I had for those stories when I was growing up, right? Because, you know, we didn't have those stories when we were growing up. And so that was me thinking, gosh, this is a story I wished I had. And so I will now that I'm a writer, I will now write that story. And then with my next book, That Thing We Call Heart, I was thinking about, I was learning more about the history of partition. And then I was thinking about, you know, how this is tragic, all this tragedy, all this death. You know, it's the biggest mass migration, human mass migration in history, and nobody talks about it, right? And I was thinking, well, how does, you know, when that kind of trauma occurs and no one talks about it, how is that trauma carried forward through the generations, you know? And so That Thing We Call Heart has a whole partition theme to it. I was also thinking about, you know, in that book that there is a romance, but it's turns out not to be a healthy romance. And I was thinking about how sometimes, you know, brown women get exoticized, and that is the basis of the relationship rather than like who that the boy actually seeing the girl. And Maureen Sharma Hits the Road, I was thinking about the importance of friendship. And so there's no romance in that book, and it's all friends. And you can see, you know, friendship is still a pretty important role in the Marvelous Mirza Girls. So it's really kind of, you know, and now I'm a mother, right? I have 2 children. And so I think when I write books, the mothers just feel more real to me because I am one. And so I'm thinking about them a lot more. And which is funny because when you're a teenager, I heard this interview with oh my God, I'm blanking on it, but the star of Better Things, right? Who also like writes and directs it. And she was talking about how she has 3 daughters and of varying ages. And she was like, when they didn't give a shit about my life or my day or what was going on with me, and I think as teenagers or whatever, we don't think about that necessarily. But now as a parent, I think, oh gosh, especially because we know how much what parents do affect both their children in the present and then in the future, right? The people they become. So.
No, and I really relate to that sort of last thing you're saying, because I mean, you've met my daughter, like I'm a mom now too. And I just love the contrast between Ruby and her parents, because I felt like that's so reflective of our generation, like trying to undo what came before kind of, but also keep whatever the good things were. And I love your answer to that question, because it sort of feels like your books have sort of charted your life and your kind of trajectory, and I know we talked about this a little bit, but I'd be curious to hear what you said. So it really resonated with me when you said that you wrote Skunk Girl because you were like hungry for that kind of story. And I remember reading Skunk Girl before I knew you in 2007 and just being like, oh my God, it's like seeing myself on the page, and it just made such a difference to me. But now, there's a lot more South Asian writers out there. You were one of the first, I think, that I remember reading. And so you and a lot of other people have sort of changed the culture. So what are some of the stories that you're interested in hearing from South Asian writers now? Like, has your idea, like, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, when you wrote Skunk Girl, you felt like there was nothing else out there, right? Like, so what, are you still trying to fill gaps, or do you feel more freedom to kind of tell different kinds of stories, or how are you feeling about that situation now?
Yeah, so there are obviously so many more diverse books now than there were. So Skunk Girl, it was the first, as far as I know, and I'm pretty sure I'm right, it was the first young adult novel with a Pakistani American protagonist.
Yeah, I can confirm that, because I remember when it came out, it was. Yeah, I can confirm.
And I think maybe even Muslim American. So we've come a long way, baby, right? As they say. And yet there's still so many stories about brown women that haven't been told, and I think there's an argument to say that, oh well, we need to move. A lot of the stories before focused on sort of generational conflict and trying to balancing parental expectations with what you want to do, and I would say I think some of those things are still relevant, and so it's not that I don't think those stories are important, but just to have stories about South Asians who are where the South Asian isn't necessarily the central focus of the story, but they're saving the world, or they're fighting dragons, or they're just falling in love, or whatever it is, they're doing those things. And because I don't, and I like you and I don't go about our day constantly thinking about our identity, right? It's, oh, I'm a South Asian woman sitting down to eat breakfast.
What impression have I faced this morning?
Yeah. But and how much I think the issue is not that there's not writers to write these stories. I think the issue is that I don't think publishing has fully embraced the scope and depth that our stories are capable of, and I think I think there's still a fear of, oh well, we can only have so many books on the market that have Chinese American female protagonists, because not people only buy one a year, or whatever the capitalist forces are, and I think that's like a real problem. And I think once publishing gets more diverse, whenever that happens, hopefully that'll start to, I know it's been a while, so hopefully that'll start to change.
Yeah. So speaking of which, so I usually start with a land acknowledgement, and I forgot to do that today. So I just want to acknowledge that a great place for good books is on the unceded ancestral territory of the Ohlone people. And the reason I'm thinking of that is when you're just talking, I was just thinking about all your different books, and like how the thing we call Heart is like such a Southern book. And then you have like a road trip book. And now this book is about Delhi. And it's such a great portrait of Delhi. So Sheba and I were actually living in Delhi at the same time. And so many of the things that are in this book, I just like remember from my compound and, my apartment and stuff. And like the obsession with pollution and the blinking kind of ear monitors and stuff like that. So I just want to know a little bit more about how you approach writing about place, and if it's just like kind of a coincidence that your books are all very place-based, or if that's something you do kind of consciously.
Yeah, it's so ironic to me that you're asking this question, because I am I'm such a dialogue junkie, and my stories almost always, like, some people have an image or an idea. I get snippets of conversation. So I hear a character talking or two characters talking, and that's where my stories come from. And then I often feel like I have the dialogue and then I have to like fill in the rest of it. And then, I have, I have students, because I teach writing as well. And I have students who, and it's so fascinating because they'll have this like really vivid setting, and then they'll struggle with, well, what do my characters say to each other, which to me comes so naturally. And so, and then I've been thinking about if part of that is because there's a great Dorothy Allison essay about place in a Tin House anthology. She talks about how, we need to move away from thinking of place as just like setting, and has this argument that place is actually just emotion, and what our surroundings mean to us emotionally in that place. And I wonder if part of it is that sometimes with writing, when teaching writing, we tended to separate the craft elements as they're very like disparate things, like dialogue, set, and whereas actually they're all working together. Emotion is like everything, right? So I think that's been helpful to me to stop thinking about setting as like, I have to have a detail of like where this person is sitting in this moment, and thinking about it as more of like an emotional thing. But with Delhi, I think in some ways it was easy to write place in Delhi because I'm I lived there for several years, and there's so much about Delhi that really just, so Noreen has never been to South Asia, and she lives in America, and there's certain things about when you first arrive in Delhi that are just going to smack you in the face, right? I know,
100%.
Yeah, and she arrives in December, which is like height of like around New Year's, which is the height of smog plus pollution, and you have some post-apocalyptic skies sometimes. The moving through public space and feeling the lack of female presence and the male gaze, and so some of those things were just so easy for me to write about because there were things that I had to deal with personally, and they're very visceral things. Like that pollution in Delhi is a very visceral thing, and the male gaze and being a woman in public space in Delhi is a very visceral thing. So things about writing at Delhi were easy, and then certain things. So I've been to all the sites that are mentioned in the book already, but in writing the book, I revisited all of them with like a notebook and a pen, and wrote. If I smelled something, I wrote that down, or if I saw something interesting, I wrote that down. So I did do sort of a more sort of research, like traditional research around place as well. So some of it was kind of just innate of like things I had experienced, and some of it was research.
But I feel like, it's funny that you just said that you're good at dialogue, because that's one of the things I love. I actually have noticed that about your books. It's something, the voice and the dialogue is like so strong. And some of the dialogues are just so Delhi. I just love them. Like Geeta Auntie is the name of the neighbor, right? The kind of sassy auntie.
Yeah.
She's so Delhi. Like I feel like her intonation and everything. So I really appreciate the point you're making, that writing about places isn't just setting, it's also the way people talk and the way people think about things. And,
it was really fun to write in Indian English. Indian English is kind of its own language, and that was one of my favorite parts of writing the book.
I love that, because you were saying Delhi like smacks you in the face when you moved there. I actually moved to Delhi from Bangladesh, so I was already living in India. But when I got there, I was like afraid about learning Hindi, and I was like, I have to learn English all over again, because I have no idea what anybody is saying because of all the slang, right? So it's totally unique. So another thing that I wanted to ask you about, speaking of place, is that there's so much great kind of organic political stuff that happens in your book. And this was another thing I just strongly related to, having lived there. It's just like, you open the paper and there's another example of Islamophobia or sort of anti-Dalit violence. And there's this whole group of people who just sort of exist. And that's, my group. I'm not Muslim, I'm like a high caste Hindu, right? So there's a whole group of people who don't have to deal with it. And then there's just like the rest of the country who does. And I just love the way that you sort of organically wove that into the plot, because that's very much what it felt like there. So I was wondering what political work, if any, you wanted your book to do, and if politics is something you think about when you're making art, or if this particular book, it was just something that happened, or how did that work exactly?
Yeah. So I guess I would say a few things in response to that. So there's an argument that all art is political, and sometimes we have this debate in my class, and almost always the students who argue that art doesn't have to be political, are white students. It's very rare that a person of color makes that argument. So I think, given given that in Western literature, it's only very recently that we have been able to tell our own stories. The mere fact that a brown person is writing a story about brown people, is political. And I'll also, like, there was this, so this was years ago, but it was after 9/11, maybe a few years after 9/11. I don't know if you remember this, but they had a reality show, and it was about Muslims, maybe in Detroit. I don't know if you remember this. So and there was this huge outcry against the reality show, because people were saying, like Islamophobic people were saying, how dare this show depict Muslims just going about their regular lives and like getting into arguments about who's going to do the dishes, or just like normal people. And so
that's not the outcry I expected you to say.
No, because the show was just about them going about their everyday lives, and that was offensive to a lot of people because to them, well, Muslims are the other and they're terrorists, and how dare you try to show them like they exist in the world just like regular people. But the point I'm trying to make is, even if as a brown writer you're not trying to make some overt political point, just writing about brown people like going to the grocery store and living their lives like regular people, that in and of itself is political. I don't think, and then there's the argument that with craft, like if Alexander Chi's like writing is a series of decisions, and Matthew Salesi's in his books, talks about how craft is political, and the choices you make in writing, things you decide to do and the things you leave out, all of that is political because it's based on the assumptions you have and the biases you have. And so I don't think there's any way you can separate like politics and art. I think it's more about, well, were you trying to make an overt political message with your book? And the other thing I would say is, you can, if you read my book, you'll know I'm not a fan of the current, right-wing fascist Hindu nationalist government in India.
Really?
That's pretty clear. But it's, I almost liken it. So Noreen is aware of sort of the politics and things that are going on in India, and I think if she wasn't, it wouldn't be true to her experience. Like, for example, if you're writing a short story and the protagonist was a Democrat, and the short story is set the day after the election in 2016, and you don't mention the election,
right?
It's not going to be real, because all any of us were thinking about that day was just the election and how could this happen and what's, the world is whatever. And so Noreen, although she comes to India and she has privilege because, she's an expat, etc., she comes from a Muslim background. And so if you're moved to a country that is targeting Muslims and like telling them that they don't belong, and then every day you open the paper and then you're reading about like really graphic, awful violence against Muslims, sometimes done by agents of the government, you're going to be very aware of that, and so and as well as the type of circles that she's running and would be like discussing these things. And so I think it wouldn't have been true to her story to not talk about the political aspect of what's going on in India, because she would have been very aware of what was going on.
Yeah, as you were saying that, I feel like that's half of the politics of your book, and then the other half is just how much like joy Noreen gets to experience. I feel like I have such a hard time selling or publishing things in which brown women just like get to be happy, and like Noreen just has like a lot of great sex in this book, and it makes me so happy, because you just like never see that. So can you talk a little bit about that? Was that again a natural thing, or was that a conscious decision to just have like a joyful character who wasn't burdened by her oppression every single page,
Yeah, I definitely, so I knew I wanted to write a book set in Delhi, and one of the things I wanted to explore was what it's like, kind of the layers of what it's like to fall in love with a person while also falling in love with a place, and how those two things can inform each other. And I also want it to be like, I want it to be a sex positive book. I think particularly for South Asian women, you know, we often face like a lot of like slut shaming and body shaming. And, you know, we come from a culture where definitely, like, you know, since colonialism, like we don't openly talk about sex. And so I think it's even more important for brown women to, you know, talk about sex and enjoying sex and desire and all of that. And then I also find it really fascinating. And I think you could say so in a lot of places, but, you know, Delhi is a very, and India in general, it's not an easy place to be a woman. But at the same time, you know, you could still be a woman there and have amazing experiences and accomplish amazing things, right? And so Noreen is living in this city, has moved to this city where, you know, there's this oppressive male gaze, and it's being in public space can be challenging. And yet she has this like sexual awakening and almost like sexual liberation, you know, in Delhi. And so that was something I wanted to explore too, because I think sometimes how complicated like non-Western countries can be is not always reflected, you know, in stories.
Hardly ever reflected in stories, I think, which is why it was like so refreshing to see it in your book. So I have a bunch more questions, but Kathleen, I just wanted to check, because we're almost at the half an hour mark. Are there any questions in the chat that you want to turn to, or should I keep going?
There's none yet, but okay. I have a question, if I can start it out. Sheba, did you always aspire to write YA? Because I really think that your books are a crossover. I mean, I think that adults will fall in love with this book as much as, you know, teens. So
I just wanted on the record that I said this exact same thing to her like 2 days ago, Kathleen.
Yes.
So thank you for bringing this up.
Yeah, so I did not aspire to write YA. And then when I joined my MFA program, Kevin Brockmeyer was a visiting professor, and he taught, and a lot of MFA programs, especially back then, had a lot of genre snobbery. And so I'm pretty sure this is the first time in the history of like the IA Writers Workshop that they had a children's fiction workshop. So he taught like his regular workshop, but he had an elective called Children's Fiction Workshop. And I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. Like, let me take this elective. And it was in that class that I started writing Skunk Girl, which again, like I was saying, arose from this need of like, oh, I would have loved to have this story when I was younger, and that kind of set me on and I realized, you know, I really do love. There's something about sort of the teenage years and the coming of age that I'm really drawn to, and I think there's still some stuff that I haven't fully processed from my own coming of age. So I think I'm still like working through that in my books. But at the same time, and I think part of the reason the Marvelous Mirza Girls feels like a crossover is because I think I'm also thinking just more as a mother, and like the relationship between parents and children. And the mother kind of has her own stuff going on in the book. And so that said, 50% of YA readers are adult women. So it does anyway, the genre has crossover appeal. But
well, I can say that at GGP, I would say that 50% of our YA sales are to women.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's partly because there are still things.
Firefighter.
And your favorite firefighter?
I do. I have a firefighter who buys all our YA books, and they make fun of him at the firehouse.
I love that. But yeah, I wonder if it's because as women, coming of age as a girl is complicated and hard. And I wonder if some of us are still working through it as well, just as readers. And that's why some women are drawn to YA.
Well, we do have a question from Kabir. And he said, I loved how the deli maids and cooks and drivers and other people like this are speaking characters in your book. Could you talk about this?
Yeah, you know, I it's interesting that you say that, because I was a little, you know, when I look at my book, I think, well, they have this maid who comes, Sarita, who comes for a few hours every day, like 6 days a week. And I know like Noreen and Ruby, being the people they were, would have had conversations with her about her life. And I did have a little more about her life in like an earlier draft. And that is not in this final draft. And so part of me wishes that, and part of the reason is that her story, the story she ends up like telling them about her life is pretty tragic. And her daughter is beaten into a coma by her alcoholic husband, and et cetera, et cetera. And my editor was like, I think it might just be too much tragedy and which was funny because I whenever I lived in Delhi, I would have conversations with my maids and ayahs about their lives because I was curious. And this is not to say that they were tragic people, but they had a lot of and every time, a lot of very difficult, tragic things were happening like to them and also to people that they were close to. And I didn't explore that much in the book. And so I'm glad that you think that I gave them a voice, because that's one thing I struggle with a little bit. Because it still is very much like Noreen and Kabir and her mom's story. So.
Sam, do you have any questions?
I'm sorry that I jumped on late, Sheba. It's so nice to meet you, and I loved your book. And I loved the relationship between Noreen and her mom Ruby. And you already touched in terms of sort of how that mother-daughter relationship is often portrayed as a generational, conflict, and possibly more so for immigrant families and these expectations that young kids raised in the US, but I just love, they were so authentic with each other. And Ruby was so wild. Like she finds her own fun thing when she's there. And just all the references, smoking pot. I mean, I thought they were great. I just appreciate that so much. I do have a question about this. I just love how you handled the grief piece of it. I thought that to me was so refreshing too, because you can feel how much she's feeling this loss of this beloved aunt, and yet she still is having, like you brought up. And that happens with everybody, right? Like everybody she meets is sort of dealing with the realities of Me Too and these horrific things happening in Delhi, and they're still having joy, and they're still being creative, and they're still, doing all that. So I just love that. It's like tension that you create very beautifully. And I just wondered if the piece around the grief, sort of, I don't know, just kind of how you thought about that and framed it for her and for her mom too. And the part of music. I would love you to talk a little bit about how you weave all the wonderful music references in as well.
Yeah, so in terms of the grief, I think that, it stemmed originally from this essay. I think it was an essay that I read in the New York Times, where someone was writing about how it had been a few years since their partner had passed away, and they think that they should be over it, and they're saying, I'm still not over it, and is there something wrong with me? And then someone tells them, instead of thinking of it as like a handicap or something that's wrong, think of it as a reflection of the depth of your love for the person, right? And instead of running away from it, in a way, embrace it. And I thought that was really beautiful. And I think that's a hard, I think, that's something Noreen is figuring out, and when the book opens and thinking, I should be fine, I should be excited for college, and it's been a year, and why am I still so sad? And part of what she goes through in the book is sort of coming to terms with, well, she's always going to have that grief with, inside of her, but that doesn't mean that, like you said, she's not going to have joy. And that's also obviously plot wise, the reason she defers college and decides to move to India with her mother. And in terms of music, I always have music in my books, and I think that just, if you talk about place being emotion, I think, music is emotion too. And, for so many of us, like I think almost everyone I know loves music, and but often when you read fiction, like when you read novels, it's almost like they live in a world where no music exists. And I also think, you know, it's not when we have memory, like, you know, if you break up to a boyfriend to a certain song, or if you have your first kiss to a certain song, or, you know, like songs have meaning to us, you know. And so I was also thinking about, well, what music is surrounding Noreen that 5 years from now, when she hears that song, it's going to remind her of like the first time her and Kabir had sex, or the first time she saw this Bruin, or whatever it is. And I think, you know, I think music is it's just such an impactful thing in our lives that I like to include it in my books.
So we have a few questions. We have one from Cynthia. Thank you for your insights, and I appreciate that. I appreciate how all of your books speak about the female experience. Have you thought about writing YA from a male boy perspective?
Never. Yeah. No, you know, I don't. And not even, never thought about writing from a male perspective, or even having like some sort of dual POV. I don't have any interest in writing from male perspective. I feel like I haven't heard enough female stories. I also, I mean, I'm a cis woman, and I love being a woman, and I love writing about the female body. And so it's just, I don't, unless, I mean, something might change in the future, but I that's the POV I want to write in. And partly because I think, you know, there's so much more to be said.
And then we have another question from Seema. How do you think Noreen's relationship to her mom compares to the mother-daughter relationships in your other books? I'm thinking that thing we call a heart. Was it harder? Was it harder or easier to write than the others?
Yeah, so in that thing we call a heart, it's more of sort of the traditional relationship that you think of, where the mother is very kind, and so they do have a loving relationship, but it's not the sort of, you can talk to me about anything and we can hang and you know, make some crass jokes together, and like sort of really I think the thing about Ruby and Noreen is that even though they have each other's best friends, they truly enjoy just kicking it together, you know. And that's something that after I had kids, I think I started Ruby is like me, someone who was raised here. And so I feel I would like to think that I have like a more experiential understanding of what it's like to grow up here. And so that was one thing. And so, you know, so Ruby kind of understands a lot of what Noreen's going through, and is very open to talking about it, and is like sex positive and all of that. And I also think, you know, with this book, I was thinking about, well, you know, when my daughters are young now, but when they're teenagers, like what kind of relationship would I like to have with them? And it would definitely be one where they just enjoy spending time with me and feel like because I do think, you know, a lot of times with parents, you feel like there's this part of my life I share with my parents, and then there's certain things that I just can't talk to them about, or I you know, that's closed off to them because they'll be judgmental or whatever it is. And so I think in this book, I really wanted to explore what is it like if, as a daughter, you know, you can have a mother who you feel like you can turn to, like, you know, if you have an issue, whatever it is, like your mother would be the first person, one of the first people you called, and what would that be like?
So we have a comment from Pallavi Banerjee, and she writes, I'm so excited that I got to catch this. My Mirza Girls is still on its way. I can't wait. But you know, I loved all your previous books. There's always so much joy and at the same times in the lives of the characters, and it's particular kind of joy that is
I think it's
textured.
joy and poignancy, she's saying, right?
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay.
Do you want to finish?
Sure. So it's a particular kind of joy and poignancy that is textured in particular, and then your protagonists are very often on a journey. Can you talk a little more about that? How central these emotions and experiences are to the development of your characters? So I think it's a question about how your characters take journeys, and then how joy and poignancy are central to the development of your characters. I think, Pallavi, if we're getting this wrong, if you could just add to the chat, that would be helpful.
Yeah, well, in terms of journeys, I think my last book is a road trip book, and then this one is, you know, she moves to India, and I think and we were talking about how my writing often reflects my life. You know, I moved to Nashville in 2013, and it's my first time living in the South, and so I think part of writing a book where these New Jersey teens road trip through the South was just kind of following my life and you know, my surroundings. And then obviously having lived in India, like back and forth Delhi as an adult, then I really wanted to write a book about, you know, what it's like to move there. And I imagine, like, I moved there as an adult. And so it was definitely on my mind of like, what if you move here, like, you know, when you're 18, and what would that be like? So, and in terms of the emotions, I think, you know, every journey is grounded in emotion, and where you began and where you end up is very, you never know, you know, but along the way, you know, I think emotion is often the driver, right, of like both where you start and where you end.
So I have a question for you guys. How did you two meet?
In Delhi.
We met in Delhi, but did we not meet in New York? Because I think we were there at the same time.
I don't feel like we met in Delhi.
Did someone introduce us? I don't know how we got connected.
I don't remember. We got connected, and did we first meet when you came over to my flat in Delhi, maybe?
Yeah, and then I remember actually having dinner with you. So Sheba was working on the draft of this book. And I remember we had dinner at one of those like really generic cafes that always had like the same menu. You know what I'm talking about? Like the jalapeno poppers and like, and I remember you telling me, you were like, I'm writing this book that's supposed to be about the girl, but I'm just like so much more interested in the mom. So I don't know what I'm gonna do. So it was so cool to read how that actually like panned out.
Now, do you guys share your work with each other? Is that something you do?
You know, we actually haven't yet, but I think it's something we might do.
Yeah, I think that might be.
Because I mean, you guys really bounce off each other. That's why I was.
We do. I think that like when I met Sheba, I was turning in the copy edits for my book, and I've had an extremely unproductive 4 years since then. So I haven't really had anything to exchange. But actually, that's actually a good segue. If it's okay, Kathleen. There was another question that Sheba and I was talking about, which is about making art during the pandemic. So I was just wondering how is it going for you? And I also just want to add that while Sheba was writing this book and while it was coming out, she organized this amazing auction for India that raised over $50,000 for like COVID relief in India. And she had her book come out, and she's like creating somehow. So tell us your secret. How are you doing all these things?
Keep laughing, I think, is which you can see in my books too, right? All the characters like cry and laugh. But no, I think in terms of, oh God, it was so crazy. We've talked about this, Mathu, about, you know, how when I was writing this book, I never could imagine that when it was published, there would be like this devastating second wave in Delhi with people dying on the streets for lack of oxygen, et cetera. And how, you know, it does feel a bit like historical fiction because, you know, the second wave is fading, but what's Delhi going to look like on the other side of this? And I think in terms of making art during a pandemic, it's interesting because I write contemporaries, and, you know, often unless your contemporary is supposed to be set like in a particular month or year or whatever, your editor will tell you to like erase any references to time so that when someone reads it, it can feel like, oh, it's happening now. And in terms of writing, I'm like, I can't envision writing anything that is set now, because I couldn't have told a year ago, I couldn't have envisioned what would happen now, right? And then so what's going to happen a year from now, I can't say. And I think so much has happened that we haven't even been able to process, but whatever has happened since March 2020. So how will that unravel, and what will we be like? What is the world, you know? And so everything that I've been thinking about and, you know, working on a short story and writing has all been set pre-pandemic, because I just feel like I don't know. I can't predict like what the fall is going to be like. We were talking, I'm like, I have an in-person event. Will I be able to go to the in-person? I don't know. And so so creatively, I've been looking backwards basically, and writing stuff that takes place before the pandemic. And it's interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was gonna ask, because Skunk Girl was actually set in the early 90s, right? I think you mentioned that. Would you ever, but that's your only book that was set in the past, I think, right?
Yeah.
So do you have that urge now to go back like even farther in time?
Not so. I have on the back burner my historical fiction novel, which is set in the 13th century. But the novel that I'm sort of, thinking about in the back of my mind, which is set again when I was a teenager. So, early 90s, which feels like a long time ago now. So yeah. And then the short story I'm writing has Ruby as the protagonist, but it's set like 1 or 2 years before the novel. So.
Oh, that's cool. I love when authors do that. I love knowing the backstory of characters.
Yeah, it's been really fun.
Yeah, so do I.
Yeah.
Sam, do you have another question or comment?
So another thing I was really struck by was the way in which sort of faith and the sort of religious themes that weave together. And I've never been to Delhi or India, so it was wonderful to sort of experience with her where she gets to go and Kabir takes her to all these beautiful old ruins, and she leaves the message for the jinn. And I don't want to say too much, but like she's having these wonderful new experiences, and she's trying to figure out, like, do I actually believe this? Like, can I wrap my head around this new idea? And so my sense is that's very much what Delhi is like, that it's all just intermingled. But if you could talk a little bit more about the sort of spirituality and faith piece of it.
Yeah, we were talking about, is this book political? And right now the Indian government is basically trying to erase the Muslim history of Delhi, and like they're literally erasing like Mughal emperors from history books, and so the Delhi that you see in the book, all the ruins he takes her to were built by like Muslim kings, and the jinn are Muslim saints. Is what's interesting about the ruin where the jinns live is that the majority of people who go and leave their letters are not actually Muslim. And so that speaks kind of profoundly to how, Islam still is very, like Delhi is still a city really rooted in Islam. And when I say Islam, because the problem is, I think when you say Islam, people often think about, it in this sort of very like scriptural or traditional way of like, oh, that means that you do the 5 prayers or that you believe in these things. And when I say Islam, I'm talking more about, I'm including things like architecture, a certain set of ethics, certain ways of being, like Muslims' attitudes towards dreams. And a lot of that is woven into the fabric of Delhi in ways that people don't even realize. And that's something that the government has been trying to erase, right? Because they want India to be this Hindu nation. And so, and I wouldn't say it was overtly political, because in terms of Kabir is someone who is fascinated by that history and who has a Muslim grandmother and who has visited Sufi saint shrines all his life. But, I think there are people in Delhi who maybe have not seen, let's just say it's a very Muslim Delhi that is shown in the book. And again, that's not that they're even hanging out with Muslim people, but that they're visiting places in Delhi that still have like this Muslim spiritual, essence to them. And then she has this sort of spiritual moment where she feels her aunt, who was quite religious, and that takes place in this like abandoned mosque, and so also that idea that faith and spirituality, you can find them in very unexpected places, and often those places aren't always the houses of actual worship, but rather places where that still like retain some memory of the past, or some connection. I think with the ruins, part of the reason Kabir is so fascinated with them is that it's, Delhi has had a lot of upheavals with partition, et cetera, and has seen a lot of violence. And these are places that have endured and that still have a lot of beauty, and are still, in spite of the government trying to erase the Muslim past, like they're still there. And they have like a lot, sort of a deep, profound meaning for both of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Does anybody else have a question or comment? We have on Facebook Live, we have, you guys know Sherry Brown? She says, hello, ladies.
Sherry.
Hello.
Oh, that's it? Oh, there's a, she just said that. Hi. Thanks for coming.
I have one more question. I know that both of you teach. How do you separate that part of your life from your creative life? I've always wondered that.
Sheba, do you want to start?
Yeah, it's when I'm teaching, I'm not getting much writing done. I don't know what it's like for you, Mathu. Yeah, I do. I think one thing I do think teaching writing starts to inform your writing, because, you know, if you're telling your students you should be thinking about these things or considering these things, and obviously when you start looking at your own writing, you're like, oh, well, I should do as I say. So and I think, you know, I think it makes you more aware of how impactful writing can be. And I don't mean that, I mean, I just like as I see my students and what they're writing and how it makes them feel about themselves and how happy they are to be able to express themselves. It's kind of, it's just a reminder of, you know, it's a very powerful art, writing. You know, the pen is a powerful tool. But it is hard, you know, especially with kids, to balance the teaching and the writing. And so I do, you know, during the academic year, I'm not I'm not getting as much writing done as I'd like.
Yeah, so for me, I've only actually been teaching writing the past like year or two. My profession is actually like, I'm an educator. That's what my degree is in, and that's the work I do. So I find teaching really energizing, because it's like, for me, it's the thing I like know I'm good at. So there's no like inner edit. It's like a break from my inner editor when I'm writing. But before these past couple of years, you know, I taught when I was in India, but it was all kind of like either educator training. So I've done a lot of like teacher training, and then a lot of sort of like social justice type youth work. And so a lot of my teaching exposed me to situations that inspired me to write, and to issues that kids were facing that I was more interested in. So that sort of like started my research. This year, I mean, like between trying to earn money and taking care of my 5-year-old, like writing has not been a priority, I have to say. So this year's been a little weird, but normally teaching is kind of a source of inspiration for me, I think, because it's not always focused on writing. So yeah, I have a couple of questions, but Samantha, you're unmuted. Do you have another question?
Nope, I'm good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Kathleen, can I ask maybe one more question
Sure.
to wrap us up? Okay. So I couldn't let you go, Sheba, without asking this question. So you are such a great romance writer, and you have also edited an erotica anthology. So you're like basically an expert. So for all the budding romance writers who are out there, can you give us some tips, both on writing like romantic relationships, but you also have so many great different, like, there's so many different kinds of love in your book, right? There's the love between mother and daughter. There's Adi uncle, who I just adore. There's the love of someone who's passed away. And then there's like romantic love. So can you talk a little bit about how you write love and relationships, and any like hot tips you have for us?
Again, so ironic you're asking me this, because I think writing something like romantic relationships or something that I thought, oh God, it's really freaking hard to write about two people falling in love. And I never thought I would. And then when I started writing about this book, you know, set in Delhi, with Noreen going to Delhi, and maybe it's partly because I, you know, met my partner in Delhi. So it's that, like, I have this association anyway with that. And so I think, you know, it was really, really joyful for me to write a book about two, like, essentially like good, kind people finding each other. And there were moments, writing it, where I would like writing a scene between them, where I would become suddenly overwhelmed, you know, with that. And so I'm like, okay, if I'm feeling this way, I think it's working. But in terms of, you know, the other kinds of love, I think that's really important. And I actually think, even though I wrote sort of this romance, that the other kinds of love aren't emphasized enough in our society. And I think, so Esther Perel, who's the, talks about the therapist, talks about love, or the psychologist, she talks about how it's only in very recent times that we have this expectation that our partner be our best friend and our travel companion and everything. And she's like, it's not supposed to be that way. You're supposed to have like your village, and that's how it should be. And expecting your partner to be your everything is putting like, it's not fair, right? Because no one can be everything. And I think, friendships for me have been really such a sustaining life force. And some of my friends are on this. So thank you on this call. But so I like to talk about the beauty importance of friendships and how that can be a source of sustenance. And I know, like, for example, in the South Asian community, we have our ubiquitous aunties and uncles. But I think, for a lot of us, when we were growing up with our immigrant parents and the immigrant aunties and uncles weren't necessarily the people that you went to and to be like, this is going on in my life. Can you give me some advice about, my best friend did this to me and what should I do? And so they're just kind of people you saw at parties and you chat. They'd be like, oh, Beta, how's school going? Whatever, right? And I think for me, as a South Asian American, I love the concept of having this community of like your aunties and uncles. But I like the idea of like, I look at my friends, like, some are South Asian, some are not. And I'm like, I want my kids to have these aunties and uncles that they can look to, like for support, but also for advice and turn to. Like, maybe they don't want to talk to me about something, but they can, turn to so-and-so and ask them about it. And I think that community, that village is just so important. And this whole emphasis on nuclear family, in our modern society is brutal. And so, I think, we need a constellation of love in our lives. And that's what I like my characters to have.
I love that term, a constellation of love. I feel like that's a great way to wrap up. If other people don't have any questions, what do you think, Kathleen and Sam?
I think that's the perfect way, because that's exactly what your books are. Your books are, that's the best way to describe them. They're wrapped in love.
Oh, I'm gonna cry now.
I know.
It's true.
But I mean, it's so easy to read. You can sit down in one sitting and read almost the whole thing because you want to know what's going to happen next. And you're rooting for them all the way along. And I mean, that's the kind of book I love to read.
Yeah,
Sheba, I want to thank you.
When this came in the mail, I fully neglected my child. Like, she asked for lunch and I told her to go make it herself. Like, actually that happened. So
that's amazing.
It's definitely a one sitting kind of book. I second that.
I do want to say that if anybody hasn't bought this book yet, you can buy it at Great Good Place for Books. And our website is www.ggpbooks.com. And I can tell you that you're going to thank us if you buy this book.
Really, you should just buy all of Sheba's books and then thank us 4 times.
Yeah, thank us. I like that.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So I want to thank you guys so much for joining us tonight.
Well, thanks for hosting us.
Sam, thanks for joining us too. And Mike, thanks for being our man behind the scenes.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
There's the ominous voice.
Thank you.
And I do want to invite everybody. Thursday night, we're going to have Printz Award-winning authors Nina LaCour, Jandy Nelson in conversation with Gail Foreman for her new book. So we would love to see you here. And you guys, thank you so much. And Sheba, I hope you'll come someday in person and read with us.
Yeah, next time I'm in Oakland, I will. Yeah. I'll do that.
Definitely.
We would love to have you.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Bye.